off limits. Thomas Massie got smoked in the 4th District Republican House primary in Kentucky this week. A month ago, the betting markets had Massie as the clear favorite by about a 3-1 margin, and polling had him leading in the upper single digits against the unknown non-entity Galrain, who refused to take positions on virtually any issues at all, and who refused to debate Massie or participate in a town hall aside Massie or anything else that would allow a direct contrast and comparison between the two candidates. But over the last month, the polling tightened and then began showing Galrain leading, and this is another victory for the reliability of polling, public polling, a thing that often gets a sloppy, bad rap by people dismissively saying that they don't trust the polls and the polls can show you anything. And of course, while there are ways to rig polls by using particular phrases or limiting the potential options or providing a list of different options that funnel respondent answers in a particular direction with multiple choice answers that may get at different perceived truths, but in ways that are of differing levels of social palatability. I'm thinking in particular of a question in the General Social Survey that asks about differences in life outcomes by race. It's effectively set up to be a nature versus nurture question, but the nature response is something along the lines of Blacks tend to have lower average life outcomes because of lower socioeconomic status and less opportunities for education, while the nature response is Blacks perform more poorly than whites because they have genetic defects. And I come down squarely on the human biodiversity nature side of that nature versus nurture debate, but I wouldn't answer the question like that if I were given an open-ended opportunity to respond. Given the dichotomous choices there, I would choose the latter, I guess, but a better, more accurate, and less emotionally charged potential response would be along the lines of Black and white outcomes differ in part due to differing behavioral and physiological traits that are rooted in some degree in biology, or something to that effect that wouldn't be so loaded in the answer. And so the point is to reiterate something that has been made here previously, which is that, yes, polls can be designed in a certain way. There are such things as push polls that can be designed to funnel respondents toward an answer that the pollsters are looking for. But that is not a valid criticism of the very straightforward binary polls like the ones conducted in the 4th District of Kentucky among registered Republicans, which is who do you plan on voting for on Tuesday in the Republican congressional primary, Galrain or Massie. Galrain ended up winning by 10 points. The polls in the last month, on average, showed him winning by a little over 3 points. And this, you might say, well, you just said that this is a victory for the reliability of polling outcomes. And I do indeed think it is, especially based on my understanding of how these things tend to play out. And one area where the polls do tend to miss a little, to be a little bit off base, is in deep red areas. They tend to underestimate modestly the support that the reddest candidate will get. And conversely, in deeply blue states, they tend to modestly underestimate how well the deepest blue candidate will do. And while Massie's defenders will say he is the most conservative, most reliably America First congressional representative in all of Congress at the moment, that is not how he was perceived by Republican voters in Kentucky. Galrain was portrayed as the rock-ribbed, reliable Republican, and Thomas Massie as the guy who had no problem voting alongside Democrats. And in particular, on the standard Republican issues front, the Galrain supporters went after Thomas Massie for his squishiness on immigration enforcement. Thomas Massie's lifetime immigration scorecard from Numbers USA is a pretty dismal 57%, dismal by Republican standards anyway. In comparison, Randy Fine from Florida, the stridently pro-Zionist MIGA Republican has a lifetime Numbers USA scorecard of a perfect 100%. Even Ted Cruz, another well-known neocon military adventurist, has a lifetime score of 92%. This is something that those of us who are opposed both to America invading the world and also inviting the world are constantly frustrated by. It seems virtually impossible to have congressional representatives who both are opposed to military adventurism abroad and are also reliably immigration restrictionist at home. But though that is how the race was characterized on the ground in the 4th District media market, the real reason for Galrain's defeat of Massie, who was a 6-term congressman who won comfortably every 2 years up until now and was beaten by a relatively unknown former military guy who had been a never-Trumper in 2016, is because of the Zionist money that backed Galrain. And we're well past the days where this is something done surreptitiously. That Galrain was the Jewish money candidate is somehow controversial. Here's what AIPAC said, gloating about the win on Tuesday night, the night of Galrain's victory. Quote, Ed Galrain's victory in Kentucky and Clay Fuller's win in Georgia ensures 2 outspoken pro-Israel voices are positioned to fill seats previously held by outspoken detractors, Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Our community was proud to help pro-Israel candidates win these races, unquote. How did AIPAC and its allies, what Walt and Mearsheimer called the Israel lobby, how did they go about supporting these candidates? From Legis One, a news site that tracks and reports on federal legislative news. Quote, anti-Massie spending, 3 billionaires and a Trump advisor. On Galrain's side, the central outside vehicle is MAGA Kentucky PAC, run by Trump senior political advisor Chris LaSavita, which has spent approximately $5.6 million in anti-Massie advertising per Axios. The PAC's 3 largest disclosed donors are hedge fund billionaire Paul Singer, donating $1 million, casino mogul widow Miriam Adelson, donating $750,000, and hedge fund founder John Paulson, donating $250,000, according to the Lexington Herald leader in USA Today. End quote. All 3 of those, Singer, Adelson, and Paulson, are all Jewish. All massive Zionists, make Israel great again supporters of Israel's militarism and expansion in the Levant. And the Israel lobby is right to flex their muscle here in obtaining a victory that without the massive influx of cash and attention would not have happened. Massie in 2022, the last time he ran against a challenger in the Republican primary, won 65% to 31%. So he had a 34-point margin of victory, whereas this time around he lost by 10 points. So that's a 44-point margin swing between those 2 primaries, and that is attributed entirely to the opposition, the MIGA-led opposition to Massie, and taken up by Donald Trump in his second term to defeat someone who is perceived as an enemy to the MIGA agenda, and rightfully so, because that is what he is, and now he is on the way out of power, to the extent that a House member can be considered someone who has meaningful power in the first place. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about how the death of the Daily Wire illustrated the seeming systemic impossibility of independent or dissident institutions of any type challenging the globo homo managerial state. And Massie's defeat here is an illustration of the same phenomenon at the directly political level. His defeat, and what likely would have been Marjorie Taylor Greene's defeat as well, had she not dropped out prematurely in Georgia, are the political equivalents to the Daily Wire being knocked out of the media sphere. Thomas Massie now will be able to do the same thing that Marjorie Taylor Greene has already done. He'll be able to go start an independent show on Rumble, doing a libertarian shaded version of the everything sucks, buy my merchandise, join my Patreon. And he'll make a lot of money out of it, and he'll have a pretty big audience, but he'll be just another voice among a bazillion others of smart guys on the outside criticizing the power structure that they are totally impotent to do anything about. And it's probably not a coincidence either that Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, just tendered her official resignation from her position effective at the end of next month. With Massie's defeat, the writing is clearly on the wall that MIGA is ascendant here, and there isn't going to be a meaningful MIGA-MAGA coalition led by elite insurgents that we talked about many times in the lead up to the 2024 presidential election. To put it pithily, the idea was that there would be a real pursuing of the MAGA agenda at home, in particular with regards to immigration enforcement, the compromise that those stalwart America First MAGA people had to give to get the infusion of resources and elite support from the Bill Ackmans and Sean McGuires of the world was to permit foreign policy to be entirely Israel first. But now, a year and a half out from that successful coalition that was built among the populist, right, and dissident elites, the singular person in a position of power and influence remaining who understands implicitly that compromise is Stephen Miller, who never countersignals any military actions on behalf of Israel and provides tepid support for foreign policy to be Israel first, but who is clearly animated by immigration, restrictionism, and enforcement at home. And given the nature of the two sides of this compromise, that the populist America First support is predominantly electoral, it doesn't have any institutional power associated with it, very little resources to devote to institution building and political victories, while the MIGA elite insurgency side has far more institutional power and resources at its disposal. It probably was a fait accompli from the beginning that the MIGA side was going to end up dominating. But there is a plausible scenario where this happens to some degree, but MIGA is just the senior partner, and MAGA still gets some of what it wants at home. And that's what it looked like in the first several months of the second Trump administration we were getting. And if we want to steelman the MIGA position and the decision to effectively drop the MAGA side of the coalition, we can do so by looking at how what the MAGA populist side of that alliance was supposed to bring to the table was public support for what the Trump administration was doing. And yet, from a political perspective, again, granting that willingness for the MIGA elite insurgency to go along with MAGA at home, Trump's border enforcement has gotten him in a lot more trouble with the corporate media and the street left than the Middle Eastern adventures have, by far. Minneapolis was shut down, and the public relations from actions by the Border Patrol trying to enforce immigration deportations of the most horrendous people in the major cities was a public relations disaster. A lot of those erstwhile MAGA, America First populist supporters got queasy about what the Trump administration was doing, more so than the Randy Fines or Miriam Adelsons of the world did. The Zionists weren't the ones who were all upset about what was happening in Minneapolis. It was the Joe Rogans and Thomas Massies of the world who threw a fit about it. And so if you're on the MIGA dissident elite side of that compromise, you're looking at this America First immigration restrictionists at home and saying, look, this is what is making our efforts unpopular. This is what is causing protests in the streets and the consequent death of American citizens as a result of what the second Trump administration is doing. It's not the actions in Gaza or in the West Bank or even the attack on Iran. Yeah, that's not polling particularly well, but it's not having anything like the kinetic, real-world, domestic, disruptive effects domestically that the immigration enforcement did. The sad reality from this Heritage Americans perspective is that Americans, even those who prioritize immigration enforcement at home and oppose military adventurism abroad, tend to get more upset by pictures of Border Patrol agents being rough with illegal aliens and American citizens trying to protect those illegal aliens than they do about 150 Iranian schoolgirls getting blown up in a missile strike. Minneapolis was shut down over immigration enforcement. Other places, a lot of other big blue cities would have been shut down as well had the Trump administration not pulled back. Was anything shut down over Gaza or Iran? The question's rhetorical. While the types of enforcement operations that occurred in Minneapolis are necessary if mass deportations are going to occur, going into blue strongholds and conducting public raids is trying to pick the highest and most difficult to grab fruit. What Reform UK is doing on the other side of the Atlantic, by contrast, is an illustration of how to pick the lowest hanging and ripest fruit. Reform UK plans to prioritize building migrant detention centers in areas that vote for the Green Party. The party is pledged to locate these facilities in Green-controlled constituencies and councils, while guaranteeing no centers will be placed in areas electing Reform MPs or Reform councils. Rhetorically, Reform is arguing that this approach ensures democratic consent. If Green Party voters and Green Party officials support open borders, well, then these places are suitable hosts for these detention centers. These are the places, if providing the migrants with hospitable environs, well, what better place to be than surrounded by people who support their presence in the country? Hilariously, if totally predictably, the proposal has drawn widespread condemnation from labor and from the Green Party and from various human rights groups. They call it grotesque and say it's bullying and it's a form of political punishment, which, my interjection here, that's refreshing to hear them say quite blatantly that diversity here is punishment. It's not fair to have these migrants in our backyard. The NIMBY acronym, not in my backyard, has been used to criticize supporters of alternative energy investments, public investments, so-called, who want public funds to be put towards building windmills, but they live on the coast and they don't want to see the windmills out at sea, or they want to allow migrants safe haven inside the borders of the United States. But as we saw when Ron DeSantis did a sort of tokenized version of what UK Reform is proposing here at a larger scale by sending illegal aliens from Florida to Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, they make it immediately and abundantly clear that they don't want those migrants in their backyard, in their leafy, clean, beautifully non-diverse neighborhoods. And so riffing on that, I suggest ITBY as an acronym to combat the NIMBY types, ITBY, in their backyard. What DeSantis did was a political teaser, but it didn't have serious consequences in any way other than rhetorically. But by pledging to make it officially enacted and sustained policy is an obvious way to effectively play politics. Politics is about rewarding friends and punishing enemies. In a word, it's about furthering the interests of those who support you and harming the interests of those who don't. Globo Homo knows these illegals are bioweapons. That's why they bring them in, and that's why they send them to the hinterlands, to places like Springfield, Ohio, and keep them as far away from places like Martha's Vineyard as they can. Not because this diversity, these migrants are some sort of blessing, but because this diversity is a weapon that has deleterious effects on the communities that have to take them. That's why they are sent to, in the American context, to red states and red communities, rural red communities in particular. The left already has a lock campaigning on positive benefits for their base with things like welfare and managerial state sinecures. By the boatload, they have these things. The right can and should and must do the same with negative benefits by keeping diversity away from their supporters and giving it good and hard to their political enemies. Since we're so heavy on the subject of migration and demographic turnover, the demographic transition, the thing that has been called the Great Replacement, as though it is some sort of new idea, I stumbled upon last week an article from The Guardian in the year 2000, a generation ago, pre-9/11 here. Pre-war on terror, pre-migration crisis in Europe. An article that illustrates the nothing new under the sun adage in a stark way. Quote, "It was news and no news, the most significant milestone in one of the most profound changes to affect the U.S. in the past century, and yet a non-event. Last week, the U.S. Census Bureau issued figures showing that non-Hispanic whites made up 49.8% of the population of California. Anglo-Saxon whites are already a minority in Hawaii and the District of Columbia. Now they are an ethnic minority in the country's most populous state, the one most usually identified with the American dream." Unquote. A generation later, we've gotten from 2 states where non-Hispanic whites aren't the majority to 9 states where that is the case. Joining California and Hawaii today in 2026 are New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, Maryland, Georgia, Florida, and New Jersey. And within the next couple of years, Arizona and New York will join them. So yes, before 2030, the country's 4 most populous states, California, Texas, Florida, and New York, will be majority non-white. For ourselves and our posterity, the founders bitterly utter as they spin in their graves. All right, but it's not really a replacement if one group is just growing faster than the other. Maybe it's a crowding, but that's not really a replacement. And if you fly from Orlando to Seattle, you will see a country, even in the contiguous United States, let alone Alaska, where there is a ton of undeveloped land. There's a lot of room for a lot more people, conceivably. Well, there are a lot of states where the white population isn't just shrinking as a percentage of the total population. That's happening in literally every state in the country. But where the absolute numbers are shrinking, that is, more whites are leaving or dying each year than are being born or entering the state. And those states are, in addition to Washington, D.C., Arkansas, California, Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa, Louisiana, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, Nebraska, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Washington State, and West Virginia. The foreign-born are moving in, the natives are dying off. In a word, the population is very clearly being replaced. We can argue about the normative terms that we associate with this. Is it a great replacement or is it a terrible replacement? We can debate why it's happening. But what is clearly beyond dispute is that it is in fact happening. And as this article will continue to show us, it has been happening for generations now. And if the purpose of a system is what it does, well, then it's hard to conclude anything other than this is what Globo Homo wants to happen. This is what the managerial state is aiming for. Back to the article. Quote, "As recently as 1970, 8 out of 10 Californians were white. Fueled by immigration at its highest rate since the start of the last century and higher fertility rates, the Asian and Latino populations of California have risen by almost a third since 1990. At the same time, with limited immigration and low birth rates, the population of non-Hispanic whites has fallen by 3%. By 2040, Hispanics are expected to be the overall majority in the state." Unquote. Previously, the article had mentioned how California is the state most associated with the American dream, and that was true up through the 90s. Orange County and 90210, the Beach Boys, California Dreaming, Hotel California. But man, how ridiculous does that sound now, 27 years later? It was the American dream. The demography changed, and now Americans can't leave California fast enough. For states like Utah and Idaho, Arizona, and Texas. The article again, quote, "The shifting sands of the U.S. reflect wider and highly controversial changes elsewhere in the world. It is an area in which few demographers dare to tread for fear of being accused of racism. Quote, within a quote, "You cannot quote me, a word out of place, and I get crapped on from a very great height," quote, said one academic. Quote, "Whatever you say, you are deemed racist," end quote, unquote. Canceling is nothing new. This unnamed academic is speaking 5 years after Charles Murray wrote The Bell Curve, 21 years after E.O. Wilson was attacked on stage by members of the International Committee Against Racism for talking about how genetics plays a part in human behavior. In the intervening years, though, demographers have figured out a way to talk about demographic transformation without being deemed racist. Instead of discussing it clinically, let alone with any sort of apprehension or uncertainty about what it might portend, they celebrate it. That's how they get around being, quote, deemed racist, unquote. If you celebrate the Great Replacement, you can talk about it. Or if you're a senior member of the SPLC, you can have a celebratory chart of it on the wall of your office where you count down the years until whites will no longer be a majority in America. But if you don't support it, well, then it isn't happening, and you're a terrible person for saying that it is. The article again, quote, "The global center of gravity is changing. By 1900, Europe had a quarter of the world's population and 3 times that of Africa. By 2050, Europe is predicted to have just 7% of the world population and 1/3 that of Africa. The aging and declining populations of predominantly white nations have prompted forecasts of and calls for more immigration from the young and growing populations of developing nations to make up the shortfall," unquote. Again, isn't new. All the problems that existed then still exist now. In fact, they've all been exacerbated. They're all worse now than they were when this article was written. To the article, quote, "Present trends have little chance of redressing the injustices of history. Native Americans used to have the lands to themselves, but are now less than 1% of the U.S. population, with little chance of becoming a majority again." Well, that's an understatement. "The biggest growth is among Latinos and Asians, particularly Asians from China and the Philippines," unquote. Indeed, there is no better testament to the civilizationally existential dangers of demographic replacement than what has become of American Indians. They experienced immigration good and hard. Some welcomed it, some resisted it, some avoided it, some tried to make peace with it. And no matter what tact they took, American Indians were subsumed by migration. High rates of all kinds of dysfunctional behaviors, living lives of despair on crummy reservations. They have the lowest fertility rates of any racial group in the United States. The remnants of these tribes are civilizationally defeated peoples because numbers are of the essence, because demography matters and migration matters. The European illegal aliens had the numbers, and the American Indians, as a consequence, lost their nation. There is an obvious lesson to be learned here about the dangers of unfettered immigration, and that it doesn't matter how you respond to it. If you permit it to happen, then your society or civilization will inevitably eventually be subsumed by it. Back to the article, quoting a member of the public the Guardian talks to who was supportive of the demographic transformation. Quote, "Jasper felt the process would strengthen Britain. Diversity strengthens a country. It makes it more exciting. We have hundreds of languages spoken. When we go out to eat, we never eat English. We eat Thai or French or Indian. It makes London a very cool place to live and work," unquote. To put it in Brian Kaplan terms, cheap chalupas make it all worthwhile. The article again, quote, "The United States government predicts that non-Hispanic whites will become a minority in the country by 2055, unquote. Well, the latest census projections have it occurring in 2043, more than a decade earlier than trends made it appear at the turn of the century. And after this article was written, 9/11 happened and the War on Terror was launched, invading the world. We were attacked at home. The Americans were attacked at home, so it became Fortress America, right? No, to the astonishing contrary, invading the world in response to an attack on the homeland is a major reason that date of 2055 was bumped up to 2043, because it resulted in, or at least exacerbated, a trend that was already occurring of being invaded by the rest of the world. After 9/11, the putative attack by Islamic extremists on the American homeland occurred. Migration into the United States by Muslims more than doubled. There aren't just far more Muslims in America today than there were prior to 9/11, but the rate of growth of Islamic migration into America increased by more than 100% in the decade after 9/11 compared to the decade before 9/11. I mentioned AIPAC and I mentioned the SPLC back there. A kindred spirit, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, describes the phrase, quote, "It's okay to be white," unquote, as a hate symbol. The pretense for that description is because there's some sophisticated dog whistling there, and that's why it's a problem, even though a statement as mundane as that on its own wouldn't be problematic, or at least we wouldn't think it would be problematic, right? That's sort of what the insinuation is. But the actual reason it's a problem is because of what it asserts in the plainest language imaginable, or at least what it tries to assert. It is debatable whether or not, in a moral or cultural sense, it is indeed perceived to be something that is okay to be white, or if it is something that is inherently sinful, if those who are white are inherently guilty of moral transgressions on account of being born who they are. I submit that it is not, in the eyes of globo homo, in fact, okay to be white. Whiteness is inherently and uniquely problematic. It's not okay to be white. And that is exactly what dissidents should pivot to. Instead of furtively placing stickers in public that read, "It's okay to be white," paint the town with flyers reading, "It's not okay to be white." That's a rhetorical trap they absolutely don't want to be forced to stumble into, because how they would respond to that would reveal a lot about what animates them. I want to turn now to an Economist YouGov poll asking, quote, "If one state redraws its congressional districts to advantage a political party, are other states justified in retaliating and redrawing their districts to benefit the other party?" Unquote. 51% of Democrats say this clear retaliation is justified, compared to just 32% of Republicans who do so. So slightly over half of Democrats, slightly less than 1/3 of Republicans think that turnabout is fair play. In contrast, those who don't think it's okay are implicitly saying that their principles tell them that they can't put their own interests, their political interests in this case, ahead of said principles. This is yet another illustration of how the right's elevation of principles and the left's elevation of interests is why the left is so much more effective, so much better at politics than the right is. You don't get any credit for being a gracious loser. If you do, the credit is fleeting, and while the disdain for being a beautiful loser, well, that just makes them hate you even more in the future. And yet with the Supreme Court ruling that gerrymandering on the basis of race violates the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which in plain language it very clearly does, with that opportunity to just rectify an injustice, even from a principled conservative perspective, gerrymandering by race is something that is against the principles that these principled conservatives hold. And so they're just being provided now with the opportunity to rectify that injustice that will also have the added benefit of benefiting them politically. And yet the only state where the Republican Party, the GOP, seems to be seizing on this opportunity is Tennessee. As an aside, to go through the math of gerrymandering and why it matters so much, envision a state with 10 congressional seats that is perfectly evenly split in the electorate among Republicans and Democrats. Well, in that case, each district's 50-50. Flip coins, you're going to have a congressional delegation to the federal government of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats on average. It'll be in that ballpark. Maybe some sessions it'll be 4 Democrats and 6 Republicans. Some sessions it'll be 6 Democrats, 4 Republicans, but it'll be close to even if the districts are politically representatively. However, the districts could also be drawn such that there are 9 districts that are 54% Republican and 46% Democrat, and 1 single district that is 90% Democrat and just 10% Republican. So like the state's big city is the one district Democrats get to dominate in, but then in the other 9 districts that are all +8, +10 Republican, well, the congressional delegation that gets sent to Congress from this very purple, half Republican, half Democrat state is 9 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And using racial gerrymandering, that is effectively what Democrats have done over the last 50 years, to the extent that they've been able to, what the Republicans were doing in the hypothetical I just raised. And yet, largely, elected Republican officials won't take advantage of it. And in their defense, as this poll shows, it's because most of their voters don't want them to take advantage of this. They'd rather be principled losers than political winners. We've talked about how in the war between the states, the American Civil War, how the North was effectively, in today's terms, what we would characterize as white nationalist, while the South was what we would characterize as white supremacist, if today we were willing as a culture collectively to take a nuanced look at things and categorize them to some greater level of sophistication than either good or bad. In the current year, those two terms, white nationalist and white supremacist, tend to get grouped together as synonyms. Yet the bloodiest war in the country's history was fought in no small degree over whether America would be a white nationalist country or a white supremacist country. And a couple of weeks ago, going through the most popular, most admired figures in world history among contemporary Americans, how well Abraham Lincoln performed. How he was in the top 3 among millennials and boomers and Xers, number 1, in fact, among boomers. And I questioned how sustained that would be going forward, given the 16th president's desire he took all the way to his deathbed to recolonize the country's black population in somewhere other than the geographic borders of the United States of America. Abraham Lincoln was a white nationalist. And to show that clearly in his own words, I'm going to read from the famous, or at least they were a generation ago when I was growing up, from Lincoln's opening in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. In a series of debates he held with Frederick Douglass for the senatorial campaign in Illinois a couple of years before Abraham Lincoln would end up being elected President of the United States. This is how Abraham Lincoln opened, as recorded by the Chicago Tribune in September of 1858. Quote, "While I was at the hotel today, an elderly gentleman called upon me to know whether I was really in favor of producing a perfect equality between the Negroes and white people. While I had not proposed to myself on this occasion to say much on that subject, yet as the question was asked me, I thought I would occupy perhaps 5 minutes in saying something in regard to it. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people, and I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and as much as any other man, I am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. I say upon this occasion, I do not perceive that because the white man is to have the superior position, the Negro should be denied everything. I do not understand that because I do not want a Negro woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife. My understanding is that I can just let her alone. I am now in my 50th year, and I certainly never have had a black woman for either a slave or a wife. So it seems to me quite possible for us to get along without making either slaves or wives of Negroes. I will add to this that I have never seen, to my knowledge, a man, woman, or child who is in favor of producing a perfect equality, social and political, between Negroes and white men. I recollect of but one distinguished instance that I have ever heard of so frequently as to be entirely satisfied of its correctness, and that is the case of Judge Douglas's old friend, Colonel Richard M. Johnson. I will also add to the remarks I have made, for I am not going to enter at large upon this subject, that I have never had the least apprehension that I or my friends would marry Negroes if there was no law to keep them from it. But as Judge Douglas and his friends seem to be in great apprehension that they might, if there were no law to keep them from it, I give him the most solemn pledge that I will to the very last stand by the law of this state which forbids the marrying of white people with Negroes. I will add one further word, which is this, that I do not understand that there is any place where an alteration of the social and political relations of the Negro and the white man can be made except in the state legislature, not in the Congress of the United States, and as I do not really apprehend the approach of any such thing myself, and as Judge Douglas seems to be in constant horror that some such danger is rapidly approaching, I propose as the best means to prevent it that the judge be kept at home and placed in the state legislature to fight the measure." Unquote. So there it is, Lincoln in his own words, that he is, in contemporary terms, a white nationalist who, if he had to choose between white supremacy and equalism, would choose white supremacy, but thinks that different people should live in different places that are more in line with their different predilections, their different attributes, their different religious and cultural and economic and artistic attributes and folkways are allowed to be expressed and flourished. In a word, that's what separate countries are for. Or, to put it in more biblical terms, that's what different nations are for. In scriptural, historically Christian terms, God made the different nations for a reason, intentionally, with the expectation that they would remain distinct. And when they attempted to rebel against this order that God had put in place by building the Tower of Babel, he destroyed it and scattered them. And so it is, with this as a hook, turned to a story from The Independent in the UK. Quote, "A towering gold statue of Donald Trump was unveiled at the president's golf course in Doral, Florida, during an emotionally charged ceremony presided over by an evangelical pastor. Placed on a pedestal in a clearing of palm trees, the 22-foot colossus depicts the president thrusting his fist into the air." Unquote. Reading now from Exodus chapter 32, verse 1. "When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, 'Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him.' Aaron answered them, 'Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me.' So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, 'Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord.' So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterwards they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." I have seen these people,' the Lord said to Moses, 'and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation.'" So to make Israel into a great nation, the golden statue had to be destroyed. To make America great again, then does this statue, this golden statue of Trump, and more importantly, what that statue represents about the nature of this second Trump administration, does it too need to be destroyed before there is any hope of making America great again? Because the parallel's not hard to see here. Taking the wary, degraded American Christian population, infusing it with a MAGA-inspired hope in 2016, and then again reinvigorated in 2024, and then ending up here in 2026, in the middle of 2026. Well, it's not difficult to see an argument, a scriptural argument, if one is so inclined, from which punishment will surely come. Tangentially related, allow this stone to cry out, a mini sermon, in contrast to modern churchianity's evolved and enlightened version of this 6,000-year-old religion. And no, it's not just 2,000-year-old. To characterize Christianity as a 2,000-year-old religion is very much to put it in a modern Jewish framework. The Christian perspective must be that Christianity began with Adam in the Garden of Eden, as recounted in the book of Genesis. Not that Christianity was some sort of a split off from Judaism, but that Christianity is the way, the truth, and the light, as recounted in a book that spans 6,000 years. And in that vein, I turn to the story of David, the one who presaged in many ways the coming of Jesus. David, existing in the Old Testament centuries before Christ himself, more than 2,000 years ago. The Philistines were menacing the Israelites. None of Saul's warriors would meet the challenge of Goliath. Through Samuel, God revealed David to be God's sword for Israel. David then slays Goliath and goes on to win many more victories for Israel. He, like his descendant Jesus, are from the tribe of Judah. They're not from the priestly tribe, which is the tribe of the Levites, but from the line compared to a lion famously. Hence, the Lion of Judah as another name for Jesus. That's important. Jesus didn't descend from the tribe of Israel that the priestly class belonged to. He descended from the same tribe, Judah, that the warrior king David came from. And so it is, in that context, a little easier to make sense of what is recorded in Matthew 10, verse 34, from the words of Jesus himself. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. 300 years after that, the Roman Emperor Constantine would say, in this sign, conquer. He was visited by God in a dream. He had his soldiers paint the Chi Rho, which were the Greek letters for Jesus Christ, on their shields, and he won the civil war for the empire at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. God laughed at Sol Invictus like Crom laughs at your four winds. Constantine converted the empire to Christianity. He convoked the council that gave us the Nicene Creed that many denominations still recite today. And he did so with an understanding of Christianity as entirely compatible with a martial orientation a Roman emperor coming out of the bloodshed of the 3rd century necessarily had to have. David was the guide in the physical realm. Jesus was the guide in the spiritual realm. That's the Christianity as Christians, as believing Christians, for centuries, for millennia, up until not quite last week, but up until a few generations ago understood to be the case. If tradition, if convention, if the original words and teachings of this religion are to be taken seriously, that is what Christianity is, and the Churchian inversion of all of that is commonplace today in mainline denominations and coming from the Vatican itself and all of the other independent so-called evangelical spin-offs that are in many ways an inversion of that. They are not, in any sense that any Christian throughout most of history would understand, anything other than anti-Christian. You might even say, in Martin Luther's terminology, that is evidence not of Christianity, but of the Antichrist. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.